Okay, so one of the things we were talking about in the last video is that life is organized. And we talked about the different levels of organization, started with an elephant, for example, maybe, and moved up to higher levels of organization like a population or a community. And then we also mentioned going down to smaller pieces, going down from organs to tissues to cells and so forth. So at the bottom of that list, at the smallest level, and that's where we're going to start today, is talking about atoms. And there are many different kinds of atoms that are these smaller functional parts. And even the atoms themselves are made up of subatomic particles. The three that we typically talk about here in general chemistry and in biology are protons, electrons, and neutrons. And the protons are subatomic particles with a positive charge. The electrons are subatomic particles with a negative charge. And then the neutrons are, well, they're neutral. And the protons and neutrons are in the center of the atom, and the electrons are sort of pulled towards the what's called the nucleus of the atom, where the protons are located. Okay, now just to be clear, the subatomic particles can also be broken down into smaller parts such as neutrinos and quarks, but that really gets into more of the sort of physics aspect of atoms, and so we don't need to go all that far. We'll just stick with our protons, electrons, and neutrons. Now, what you'll notice is that different kinds of atoms have different numbers of protons, electrons, and neutrons. They have the same basic parts, but they differ in the number and arrangement of those protons and electrons. So, for example, if you look at carbon, the carbon atom has 6 protons in the center, and you can't really see that in this picture, but surrounding the atom, the carbon atom, are 6 electrons that are attracted to the protons that are in the center of the atom. If you look at oxygen, on the other hand, it has 8 electrons and 8 protons. So what makes one atom different from another atom is the different number of protons and electrons. And neutrons come up in a different way, and we'll deal with that later on. We don't need to worry about that at the moment. In biology, we only usually deal with a handful of atoms. So although this varies slightly by organism, you can see that oxygen is the most common atom, followed by carbon and hydrogen after that. And a lot of that has to do with water being a large component of most living things. So after that, the other atoms make up only maybe 1 or 2% or less of living organisms. So these are the ones that we'll focus on in this class. Primarily, you will see and have a lot of interactions with oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and then we'll talk about potassium and sodium and chloride as well. That will cover most of the atoms that we have to deal with, and occasionally when we get into cell membranes and things of that sort, we'll deal with phosphorus as well. The rest of them, although there's hundreds of them, most of them we don't necessarily need to understand how life works in most scenarios. Okay, now back to atoms for a minute. I mentioned the electrons are located on the outside of the atom, and the neutrons are on the inside, as well as the protons, but they are actually located at very specific distances or spots. And there's sort of some rules to how the atom is structured. So closest to the atom, center to the nucleus, is what we call the first energy level of the atom. And in the first energy level, there is a space, and those spaces we call orbitals. And in one orbital, so in the first energy level, the first level, away from the nucleus of the atom, there's the first energy level, there's one orbital, and each orbital can hold 2 electrons in it. So in that first energy level, you see, we can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. Okay? All right. Now, as you move away, you start having sort of different sort of sets of rules. So when you get to the second energy level, which is a little bit further away from the atom and gives you sort of a larger amount of space, there are a total of 4 orbitals, and each orbital can hold 2 electrons. And so you could put a total of 8 electrons in that second energy level. And then the third energy level, which is further than that, is 4 more orbitals, and you could therefore put 8 more electrons. Now, there are other energy levels outside of that, but again, if you look at that list of atoms that we typically talk about in biology, we kind of really don't need any more space than what we deal with at the third energy level, or a total of 8 electrons in that outer layer. So we can stop there at that point, okay? So what ends up happening is the atom, which has the positive protons in the center, different atoms with different numbers of protons can attract different numbers of electrons. So an atom, let's say with 4 protons and it has 4 positive charges, it can attract 4 electrons. And so what ends up happening is in the first energy level, if you had 4 protons, in this case we have 10, but if we had 4, we would attract 1 there, 1 there, and then we'd have 1 more there and 1 more there. In this case, you can see we have 10. In this example of neon here, we have 10. So we have 10 protons. Therefore, you can attract 10 electrons with negative charges. And so what you end up having is 2 in the first energy level, because that's the most you can have. And then you have the other 8 in that next energy level outside of that. So we'll discuss that a little more, because that affects then how the atom behaves and how it then interacts with other atoms. Now, generally, we draw these atoms with their electrons sort of frozen in one place, kind of like you see here, sort of static where they're not moving. But in reality, what happens is the electrons are spinning around the nucleus. So they're actually moving around and spinning around in what they call kind of like a cloud. So although we make this very simplistic drawing to show where they're at, they're really not just sort of stuck there, but instead they're kind of like satellites spinning around the center of the Earth, or that sort of thing. So the electrons are moving around, and you can sort of predict based on the electrons and their spin pattern kind of where they might be at any particular place. We'll continue to draw them as static objects because it makes it easier just to sort of understand where they go. But if you take chemistry or you take physics, keep in mind that you'll probably somewhere in there someone will explain to you that they actually are moving. So I want you to be aware of that, because most of the time we'll deal with them as sort of stuck in place. Okay. In the next lecture, what we'll talk about is then how these atoms interact and then bind with other atoms based on the number of electrons they have in the different energy levels.